Start without my slides. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be back in Jerusalem talking about these two topics, which are really two of my favorite issues. I've worked on growth for almost all of my career, and I think like a lot of economists, I've started to work on inequality over the last several years because it's such a salient issue. It's such a rising phenomenon. So I will try to give you a broad view of the topic and sort of frame some of the discussion that's going to take place over the rest of this conference. We're going to be looking at a lot of data, and I'm mostly a data person, but let me start with some non-quantitative data, sort of report on the zeitgeist as you see it in America, in the UK, and in many other developed countries. I won't hazard a guess for Israel. So when people think about the economy, there's this feeling that technological change is taking away jobs, that large swaths of the labor force are being left behind. There's this real strain in social cohesion that we see in all sorts of dimensions. Meanwhile, in the United States, not so much in Israel, but in the United States and other developed countries, economic growth feels very anemic. And there's the threat of climate change and all the things we have to do to deal with climate change, which is a real issue, that probably will lead to even slower measured economic growth. So there's this feeling that the kind of whole post-war architecture, free trade, robust social safety nets, democracy, kind of liberal social order, feels like it's coming apart. And there's increased interest in all sorts of alternatives, be they socialism or state capitalism, managed trade. There's this rise in populism. All these things are sort of looking like good alternatives to what we've had for most of the post-World War II period. I'm going to show you a little data. You're going to see a lot more data later on, so I'll go through this super quickly. This is data on shares of income in the United States. This is from the World Inequality Database. So the orange line is the income share. It's not orange here, but that line is the income share of the bottom 50% of the income distribution. So even in 1970, there was a lot of inequality. The bottom 50% of the income distribution earned only about 20% of national income. And you can see that share has declined. The share of what Piketty calls the middle class, which is to say from the 50th percentile to the 90th percentile, I find that a very humorous definition of the middle class, that's gone down as well. The share of the top 10% has gone up, and most of that, I'm sorry, that's the top 10%, and most of that rise in the share of the top 10% has been accounted for by the rise in the share of the top 1%. So that's sort of one way of looking at the rise in income inequality in the United States. Here's other data on inequality in the United States and in Israel. This comes from the Luxembourg Income Survey, which we're going to hear much more about later on from Janet Gornick. This is the Gini coefficient, so it's a summary measure of inequality. You can see that inequality in both the United States and Israel has risen in this period since in 1970s. And here's that decline in inequality in Israel that Avi was talking about. No such decline in the US. It continues to rise. Here's income growth in Israel and the United States. This is just a very conventional picture. You see there's sort of trend income growth in the United States. It's actually slowed down, which I referred to before. Income growth since 1950 has been much faster in Israel than in the United States. So in 1950, Israel had less than half the income of the United States. And you can see they're now quite close to each other. And I don't think we want to forget about the importance of economic growth. We're mostly going to talk about inequality, but as someone who's been coming to Israel on and off since the mid-'80s, life here has gotten a lot better. Economic growth is really a wonderful thing. It allows society to provide everyone, including the poor, with a lot more resources. And I don't think we want to forget about the value of economic growth or stop worrying about what's driving it. All right. So when people think about inequality and growth, what are the kinds of questions that they ask? Well, here's sort of a standard list. Does growth cause inequality? Does higher inequality undermine growth? Do policymakers somehow have to make a choice between inequality and growth? And I think those are bad questions. Why are they bad questions? Well, inequality and growth are not policy levers. They're not things that sort of politicians or even that, other forces kind of change on their own. They're what economists call endogenous variables. They're outcomes of broader economic processes. And there are many different factors that shift both inequality and growth. Some of those factors move them together. Some of those factors move them in opposite directions. And so there's not sort of a generic relationship between inequality and growth. And in addition, the things that affect inequality and growth do so at varying timescales, as I'll show you in 1 second. Okay. So if those are bad questions, here are some better questions. So what are the main factors that shift inequality and growth, both historically and into the future? Are those factors going to push inequality and growth in the same direction or in opposite directions going forward? And similarly, what are the policy levers that are available, and how will those levers shift inequality and growth, both in the short and long run? So in pictures, the wrong way to think. And then the right way to think is to think about other things that affect both growth and inequality. And now I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures. Don't get freaked out. So we can start listing some of those things. So I'm going to talk about technology today, mostly. Well, I'm going to spend about half my time talking about technological change and how it affects growth and inequality. You could also talk about openness and globalization. I'll mention it briefly here and perhaps briefly later on. The effects of globalization and the effects of technology are very, very hard to sort out from each other, and they're very similar to each other. Then you can think about redistributive taxes and transfers. So this is something that Avi actually alluded to in his introduction. There's sort of a very old argument in economics and in public finance called the leaky bucket analogy. So the idea is that we can take income from rich people and we can give it to poor people. That lowers inequality. But in taking the water from here to there, some of it spills on the ground. There are inefficiencies that are introduced by redistribution. And so if you're thinking about redistributive taxes and transfers, there's this kind of trade-off between inequality and growth. I can have more growth by cutting taxes, but the cost of that is higher inequality. And then we can ask whether that's something we want to do. On the other hand, if you think about something like social investments in children, that might be something that pushes both inequality and growth in directions that we like. So in a society where many children are not fulfilling their potential, investing in them is first of all going to lower inequality because it's going to take people who would have been unskilled, low-wage workers and turn them into skilled workers. And secondly, society will have a lot more resources to work with. So that would be a case where inequality and growth would both be pushed in the direction that you like, albeit with a time delay. Then one can go further. These are the pictures that are not supposed to freak you out. You could think about all the private decisions that go into both affecting inequality and growth. You can think about how these things interact with government policies. So does inequality call forth a certain set of government policies that then kind of leads through all these levers back into inequality and growth? You can put it all together in some horrific diagram, which I don't want you to get scared by. And as I say, don't try to think about everything at once. So let's focus, to the extent that we can, on the more quantitatively important factors and channels and to the policy levers that can actually be moved. And so today I'm going to talk about technological progress and how it affects both inequality. And then I'm going to spend a good deal of time talking about the role of government and how that may change in response to rising inequality, which is, I think, one of the very important political issues going forward. Okay, so if we're going to talk about inequality, I want to take several steps back and just sort of talk about what generates inequality. We all know about inequality. I think sometimes we don't think systematically about where it comes from. So let me tell you about the economy. Okay, so we have an economy. People consume goods and services. That keeps them alive and makes them happy. Goods and services are primarily produced by people applying their labor, right? That's what we call work. I try to explain this to my children. Much of that production takes place in a market setting. Not all, but a lot of it takes place in a market setting. People who do work earn wages, okay? And then there's a bunch of work that takes place outside of markets as well. So think about all the work that goes into the family, into raising children. That's also work. It doesn't get formally measured in the economy. Wages from jobs are the largest part of income for most people. And differences in wages are the largest contributor to the inequality that we're interested in. So if you come to Brown and you take my course, I'll spend a long time talking about labor income and capital income and all those interesting things. But labor income is the biggest part of the story we want to tell. So if we want to understand inequality, we want to understand inequality in wages that different people receive in their jobs. What is economic growth? So economic growth is an increase in the production and consumption of goods sold in markets. What drives that? Well, one of the drivers is sometimes when people work more. So again, Avi talked about, for example, more women joining the labor force. That's a driver of growth. The other thing that changes growth, the biggest thing is when there are changes in production so that the same amount of work produces more goods and services. That's really the kind of the magic of economic growth. People 100 years ago worked just as hard as we do, but we produce more stuff, and that's why we're richer. Where does that come from? Well, it can come from the accumulation of physical capital, the reorganization of production. Overwhelmingly, in the long run, where it comes from is technological progress. It comes from new ways of producing goods and services using labor and also using capital. So we invent new things, we invent new productive processes, and that allows us to produce more with the same inputs. I put technological progress in red because it's really important. Okay, so why do workers earn different wages? Well, the answer from classical economic theory has a firm, and the firm is hiring workers to produce goods and services that they can sell. That's why firms exist. They sell stuff, they hire workers to produce it. Firms hire workers and pay them according to the value marginal product of labor. That's the one technical term that we're going to have today. So that's the extra amount of stuff that a worker is going to produce multiplied by the value of that stuff. So I want to hire someone if she's going to help me make more widgets, and I can sell those widgets at a good price. Difference in wages then result from different workers or different types of labor having different value marginal products of labor. If you're very good at producing something that is very valuable, then you have a very high marginal product of labor. Okay? Changes in technology of production as well as demand for final goods then change the value marginal product of different goods. So if we find a way to automate production so that you were producing something really valuable, and now I can have some unskilled person produce it, or I can have some machine produce it, then the value marginal product of your labor goes down. Or similarly, if people suddenly decided they didn't like economics and they didn't want to take economics courses, the value marginal product of my labor would go down, and tragically, my wage would. Okay, so the focus then in this sort of classic economic theory is on the supply and demand of different types of workers, what they produce and how many of them there are. Okay? So where does inequality come from? So this is really just a standard list, kind of the usual suspects: openness to trade, changes in bargaining power of firms and workers, government policy, and so on. And sort of whenever you write down the standard list of things that are driving inequality, kind of the one that pops out first is technological change. So the point is, it's in red here. It was in red in my previous slide about growth. So this same thing, technological progress, is both driving inequality and driving economic growth. Okay? And here are just some examples of the ways in which technology has replaced workers. I had to explain to my students that there used to be elevator operators. I don't know, the young people have probably never seen one of those manual things. These are all sorts of jobs that used to be done by people that are now done by workers, and these are all jobs going forward that are done by people and may be done by machines in the future. And remember, that's good in terms of productivity. We as a society now get more stuff without having to pay workers to do that for us, and so we're richer. So what's the problem then? That is, where can this kind of technological progress be harmful? Well, I'm going to kind of go through 3 stories about how technological progress can raise inequality, and here they are, sort of the short-run adjustment. Maybe machines take jobs away from everyone, and then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about skill-biased technological change. Okay, so let me talk about short-run adjustment first. This is sort of the easiest one to think about. So workers are not these sort of interchangeable commodities, the way economists sometimes think about them. Workers have training and experience that are specific for various industries. Technological change sometimes wipes out demand for labor in a specific industry. So to give my own example again, if they came up with a robot that could teach economics, which doesn't actually seem that hard, that wouldn't be bad for young people because they would just not become economists. But for those of us who have sort of invested in becoming economists, that would be very bad. There'd be kind of this slow adjustment that might involve a reduction in wages. Of course, that's only a transition problem. Eventually, people who are displaced by technology will retrain or they'll retire. Things are a little harder when that happens to a whole region. People might have to actually leave some region where kind of some industry is no longer viable. So it's a transition problem, but it might last a whole lifetime, so that could be very bad for some people. And then, of course, it's worth remembering that this has been going on for a long time. And this is, whenever you talk about sort of short-run adjustment to technological change, this is the kind of picture that you should have in your head, right? This is the share of the US labor force involved in agriculture, which goes from about 75% in 1800 down to, something like 2% or something like that. And so sort of in this period of most rapid decline, the share was declining at 5 percentage points per decade. Okay, so if you want to sort of benchmark against that, manufacturing in the US is currently 10% of employment. So if manufacturing went away over the next 2 decades, went away entirely, we think that was pretty disruptive, but that's sort of the same pace of disruption that was going on during this period, with the difference that when you leave agriculture, you actually have to move away from the farm where you lived into a city. When people leave manufacturing, they move from one job in a city to another job in a city. So it's actually less disruptive than the change away from agriculture. And of course, the shift away from agriculture is done in the United States. Okay? Well, then you might say, well, okay, isn't this churn speeding up? That there's this kind of, again, in the zeitgeist, this idea that technological progress is getting faster, and so we're not able to handle it. And I have very mixed feelings about that. So first of all, I told you that economic growth is slowing, and so it's kind of hard to reconcile this idea that we're in this age of ever faster technological progress with the fact that income growth, which is driven by technological progress, is not, in fact, speeding up. Robert Gordon is sort of the economic historian who's kind of the guru of studying technological progress. He has many papers. He has a book that's about yay thick on this. His claim, which he defends quite strongly, is that sort of the golden age of new technology was this period 1880 to 1950. And here's sort of a list of things that appeared in that period: automobiles, airplanes, network electricity, indoor plumbing, air conditioning, antibiotics, and so on. And of course, the young people say, well, wait a second, what about IT? What about the smartphones, Facebook, and all that? And Gordon's claim is that basically all these things that we so cherish are actually not so important when compared to stuff like having a fridge or indoor plumbing. It's a great discussion. Again, I spend a lot of time with my students on this. We can loop back if people are interested. Okay. Then just to show you that this idea that sort of ever faster technological progress is leading to disruption is not a new idea. Here's the Secretary of Labor from 90 years ago. I won't read you the whole quote, but basically he's saying, we live in this age of unprecedented technological progress, and it's kind of a transition problem, but we may worry that sort of technological progress is so fast that we're going to kind of have a permanent underclass of workers left behind by this. And oh, I should add, and then he talked about how we should limit immigration to deal with this. So things really don't change. But of course, what we think of as the golden age of the US economy came not immediately after this, because there was the Great Depression, but several decades after this is when we think the golden age of the US economy was. Okay. Well, what about the second problem? That maybe machines are just going to take jobs away from everyone. So, sort of in the most extreme, you hear, well, machines are going to do everything. There's going to be nothing for people to do, and that's going to be terrible. And here's a quotation that I really like. So this is from Walter Reuther, president of the United Auto Workers. I went through this Ford engine plant about 3 years ago when they first opened it. There are acres and acres of machines, and here and there you'll find a worker standing at a master switchboard just watching green and yellow lights blinking on and off, which tell the worker what is happening in the machine. One of the management people with a slightly gleeful tone in his voice said to me, "How are you going to collect union dues from all these machines?" And I replied, that's not what's bothering me. I'm troubled by how you're going to sell automobiles to these machines. So it's a great quote. It sort of really kind of encapsulates this idea that maybe there's going to be some macroeconomic problem that's going to result from the fact that we can produce without machines, and therefore there's going to be no demand for stuff. Without people, sorry. Without people. So there's going to be no demand for stuff. And I love this quote. I think it's very wry. Obviously, Reuther kind of had the better end of this conversation, but he was wrong. Okay, there are many problems with technological progress, but this is not. Oh, I'm sorry, and this is sort of the modern versions of that same idea. Those of you who hang around with macroeconomists have heard about secular stagnation, this idea of permanently insufficient aggregate demand. Proponents of universal basic income say that we need to give money to everyone simply to maintain demand. So it's actually kind of a radical idea, right? It says that we should give money to everyone not because they deserve it as human beings or we want to deal with inequality, we want to help our fellow citizens, but simply to keep the macroeconomy going because we need someone to demand stuff. That's sort of the Silicon Valley version of caring for your fellow human. Okay, so I think that's wrong, okay? So, you know, I don't want to quote old dead white guys, but like Say's law that economists have known for a long time says that supply creates its own demand. When something's sold to somebody, somebody else has that purchasing power. So if technology makes some goods super cheap in terms of labor hours, people are just going to spend their money on other things. Now, maybe people stop working, and if I have time at the end, I'll sort of touch on this more. If there's really so much productivity that kind of everyone can have everything for free, then maybe people will stop working. But, you know, that's not a problem I think that we really need to be unhappy about. Okay, so to go back to Walter Reuther's example, so here's just numbers I've made up. So suppose you can, machines can make cars cheaply than worker can. So before machines, a car sells for $10,000. Workers are paid $6,000, and $4,000 goes to supplies, costs of capital, and profits. And now we get some machines. Machines aren't free. You have to build them and pay operators and stuff like that. But suppose all that costs $4,000. So I'm replacing $6,000 worth of workers with $4,000 worth of machines, okay? Well, what happens to that other $2,000, right? I used to be paying $6,000 to workers, and they would go buy stuff. And now I'm just paying $4,000 to the people who built the machines, and they go buy stuff. What about the other $2,000? Is that the missing purchasing power? And the answer is no. Something has to happen to it. So Ford can sell cars at the same price. So they can still sell cars for $10,000. But now their profits have gone up $2,000 per car. So that $2,000 of purchasing power that used to go to workers is now going to stockholders. You might not like that in terms of distribution, but it's not as if the purchasing power went away. Alternatively, if there's competition, Ford is going to have to reduce the price of cars to $8,000. And now the people who are going to buy cars, who are going to have to spend $10,000, only have to spend $8,000. They've got another $2,000 to spend on something. So this is, you know, sort of the problem with the Walter Reuther example is it doesn't really add up. Okay. Well, then you can say, well, let's think about the inequality this way. So don't think about sort of the purchasing power problem. Think about the inequality issue. A worker is replaced by machines. Now there's one less job in the economy. And that's wrong as well, right? So one of the things we teach our undergraduates is there's not a fixed number of jobs in the economy. And that has the fancy name of the lump of labor fallacy. The number of jobs in the economy depends on the supply of labor by workers and the demand for labor by firms. That's a market. It's cleared by a price. That price is the wage. In practice, it's not just one wage. There are many, many different kinds of workers, and there are many, many different demands for them. And so it's a whole set of wages that clear the markets for labor. And that suggests that rather than talking about jobs going away, we should instead focus on what the real problem is, but the wages that they pay. So technology is not going to destroy jobs. That's a bad way to think. The good way to think is that technology may make the wages of some jobs low, and we may not like that as a social outcome. Okay? So that brings me sort of to the third channel, and I think the one that's most important, this idea of skill-biased technological change. So technological change, again, this is a point that we could fight about in the more extended version of this lecture. Technological change almost always raises average wages because the average hour of labor can now produce more stuff. But technological change is not neutral with respect to different kinds of workers. Different technologies amplify the productivity of some workers or replace other workers. And technological change, as we have observed it in the 20th and 21st century, for the most part, is skill-biased, which is to say, it makes the value marginal product of skilled people go up because the technology works well with skilled people, and it makes the value marginal product of skilled labor go down, of unskilled labor go down because technology tends to replace the things that unskilled workers do. So sort of the simplest example to think about is the large change taking place in the next couple of decades in the United States, the introduction of self-driving cars in all sorts of businesses like trucking that tend to employ relatively low-skilled people. So right now, a truck driver is a relatively low-skilled person, and he drives a truck. There are millions of truck drivers in the United States. Their labor is going to be replaced by these self-driving cars, which are themselves mostly produced by skilled workers. So there are a bunch of very, very skilled people in Pittsburgh doing AI, and they're going to invent self-driving cars that are going to be cheaper than hiring unskilled workers. And so this is sort of an example of skill-biased technological progress. The wages of skilled people go up, the wages of unskilled people go down. Whether that actually lowers the wage of unskilled people is not clear. The economics on this get a little complicated. So their absolute wages might go up or their absolute wages might go down, but their relative wage will go down. And the truth is that even if their absolute wages rise, if their relative wages fall, that may make them quite unhappy. And so I think we'll talk about this in some of the later talks as well. What you see in the United States is not necessarily that low-skilled people's wages are going down, but that the gap is opening up between low-skill and high-skill people. OK. If you want a framework for thinking about this, this is sort of the masterwork on this subject, Claudia Golden and Larry Katz, The Race Between Technology and Education and Technology. And I'm going to sort of summarize it super quick. So their story is as follows. For most of the 20th century in the United States, there was skill-biased technological progress. So that would have raised inequality. But that was offset by something, which is the increasing skill of the United States workforce. So this was a decade in which, a century in which education rose very rapidly. And so in fact, the gap between skilled and unskilled wages remained relatively constant. After 1980, say Golden and Katz, what happened was not a speed up of technological progress, but rather a slowdown in the rate of growth of the skills of the labor force. And that is what drove this increase in the gap between skilled and unskilled wages. So here's kind of my one technical looking picture for this talk. This is sort of their story in one picture. So here we're going to think about a very simple supply and demand framework. So these are relative wages of skilled workers, so the wage of the skilled relative to the wage of the unskilled, and the relative supply of skilled workers, the number of skilled workers relative to the number of unskilled workers. The supply curve the relative supply is vertical, so that just reflects at a point in time the training of the labor force. People have the training that they have, and they bring it to the labor force. The relative demand that 0 was supposed to be there after the 5, so that's the relative demand in 1950. The relative demand for skilled and unskilled workers is what depends on the technology for producing goods. So that's where skill-biased technological progress is going to show up. So from 1950 to 1980, what you have is a shift in demand. That's skill-biased technological progress. By itself, if all that happened was that the demand curve shifted, you would find that the skill premium had risen. But over the same period, the workforce became more skilled. The relative supply of skills increased. And so what you have is that the relative wage of skilled to unskilled workers remained constant over this period. Over the period from 1980 to 2010, there was again skill-biased technological progress. The demand curve shifted out by the same amount that it had over the previous 30 years. However, there was a slowdown. I'm sorry, this is the demand curve. The demand curve shifted out. However, there was a slowdown at the rate at which the skills of the labor force were growing, and therefore an increase in the skill premium. So it's not a story about kind of gee whiz technology. It's a story about the inability of the economy to produce enough skilled workers. And here's that same thing in the data. This is what they call the education plateau. So here is education at years of schooling at age 35 by birth year. So sort of the inflection takes place for the cohort born around 1950. So the people who were 35 in 1985. And you see there's this sort of long period of rising skills. And then that flattens out a lot. And that's the same time at which you get this real takeoff in the ratio of college to high school wages, which is sort of one proxy for the skill premium in the United States. And so this is the culprit. And if you want to look a little more closely, it's the guys. So here's the average schooling of men. For most of the 20th century, that's higher than it is for women. Women are catching up. And starting around the 1950 birth cohort, boom, the kind of men flatten out, and the women keep increasing. OK. So that's sort of the Golden and Katz story. So one of the drivers there is education, and that's mostly what I'm going to talk about, but the other driver is technological progress. And so that sort of raises the question, well, is technological progress always skill-biased? In fact, if you read Golden and Katz's book, they're very clear that that's not the case. In the 19th century, technological progress was unskill-biased. So in the 19th century, skilled craftsmen were replaced by unskilled workers working with machines. So it's not the case that technology is always skill-biased, but it's mostly what we see now. So technology is best at replacing routine and repetitive cognitive and production tasks. So, roughly speaking, if you can describe it, if you can say everything that a job involves, then you can have a machine do it instead of a person. Okay, so that's good for assembly line work, bookkeepers, typists. Those are jobs that tend to be in the middle of the wage distribution. At the same time, technology also, somewhat surprisingly, seems like it can replace jobs lower down on the skill distribution. So of course, I mentioned driving before. Driving is very interesting because 20 years ago, when people talked about jobs that could be replaced by machines, they would always say, well, one thing that can't be replaced by machines is driving. That's just way too hard. It's cognitively super complex. You're taking inputs from all sorts of directions, and you really have to be a human and understand humans to drive a car. That turns out not to be true. And these are sort of some other ones that can be replaced by technology. Now, there are cases where
accountants are also red.
Are also
Can be changed.
well, there's also creativity that goes into accounting, but we won't get it. So sometimes technology replaces skilled workers as well, and I think the best example of this, there was a wonderful article in the New Yorker a few years ago about this, is artificial intelligence replacing radiologists. Like, radiologists, what they do, and I have a very good friend who's a radiologist, they just sit there and they look at pictures and they interpret them. And that's the kind of thing that I think in a very short period of time, computers are going to replace. And that reduces inequality, right? Now, we all get our radiological interpretation at a much lower price, and these skilled people who had become radiologists will just do some other skilled thing. But that's going to kind of raise the relative supply of skilled workers and so drive down the skilled wage. So that's good for inequality, to say it lowers inequality, but at least so far that seems to be less common. Okay, so in the Golden and Katz framework, how do you fix rising inequality due to skill-biased technological change? Well, first of all, what you don't do is slow down technological progress. Because remember, sort of technological progress is the goose that lays the golden eggs as far as growth is concerned. It would be great if you could shift technological progress so that it replaced skilled workers rather than unskilled workers. When I talk to my roboticist friends about this and they say, oh, we're so unhappy that, we love making robots, we love doing this, but we're so unhappy that we're driving inequality. What should we do? Can you absolve us of our guilt? I say, yeah, go and, make technology that replaces skilled workers and you're absolved. But it's just not clear that that's possible. Golden and Katz have a solution, which is to just restore the growth rate of education. And I know we're going to talk quite a lot about that over the rest of today. So here's their solution. So from 2010 to 2040, once again, the demand curve shifts out. So once again, there's skill-biased technological progress. And now all we have to do is, instead of having this rate of growth of the relative supply of skilled workers slow down, we've just got to speed it back up, and we can drive the skill premium back down. So that's a very coherent solution. But there are some reasons to worry. It's just very expensive to educate people. Teachers are expensive. Time in school is expensive. In the United States, at the same time that we feel the need to increase education, we're also dealing with the student loan crisis, and state government budgets are in a lot of trouble. And then there's this sort of nagging worry that, well, we'd like to keep pushing people into higher education. It's just not clear that everyone is suited for higher education. So it's not clear that you can solve that problem. And then there are other analyses like the Brynlison and McAfee, who have a couple of famous books on this, that say it's even worse than that because, in fact, technological progress is speeding up. Okay, so my tentative prediction from this part of the talk is that technology growth is going to continue to drive wage inequality. And the technology, it has been and will be particularly bad for the skills used by lower and middle income men. For various interesting reasons, technology has not been as good at replacing the skills traditionally associated with women. I shudder a little to say the caring skills, skills associated more with interpersonal interactions. So technology is going to be bad for low-income people, for low-wage people, and particularly for low-wage men. And as I said here, almost everything that I've said about technology can also be said about openness to the global economy and the role of trade. Okay, so what interests me and what I'll try to talk about in the rest of this talk is what does society look like when you have technological progress so that there is economic growth, so that there's more total income, but the distribution of value marginal products of labor is much more unequal than it is now. What does that society look like and what does policy look like? And my guess is that sort of the resolving that issue or dealing with that issue is going to run through the channel of what government does. That there's going to be a lot of pressure on government to change things, either on the margin by tinkering with taxes and transfers and things like that, or more radically. And as I referenced earlier, sort of in the United States, it's suddenly become acceptable to talk about things like socialism that used to be sort of beyond the pale of discussion. Okay. So what's government's role in all this? So governments now in Israel and the United States and pretty much every country reduce inequality through a whole lot of channels, through progressive taxation, through explicit transfers, pensions, Social Security, and so on, and by provision of services, public education in Israel and the United States, health in Israel, but not in the United States. But of course, that redistribution is far from complete. So there's unequal value marginal product of labor. The government comes in and partially ameliorates, partially reduces that inequality. And that's all done in the context of democracy with more or less universal suffrage and one person, one vote. Okay? And so just to have a picture in your head, this is, again, the Gini index that I mentioned before. So this is just a summary measure of inequality. This is data for the United States. And the green line is the market income. So this is sort of the pre-tax and transfer Gini coefficient. Whoever made this graph, I'm very unhappy with for sort of using this ridiculous scale. They should have cut it off here. But anyway, you see that the Gini index has risen by more than 10% over this period for pre-tax and transfer income. And then this purple Gini coefficient reflects both government sources of income and also taxes, transfers and taxes. And that's risen as well. To a first approximation, these two lines are parallel. In fact, the gap has gotten a little wider between them. So you would say that in the United States, the government sort of was doing a certain amount of redistribution. The pre-redistribution level of inequality rose. And the government basically neither amplified that nor changed the degree to which they offset it. They sort of let the post-tax level of inequality rise along with it. Okay. And here's sort of a similar picture for Israel. It's slightly different data, and the definitions are different, but this is the gap between pre- and post-tax and transfer Gini coefficients in Israel for a shorter period of time, 2003 to 2013. And you see basically the same thing. The degree to which the government was doing redistribution didn't really change over this period. Okay. So that's what we have kind of going backwards. But as I said, I think there's going to be pressure for change going forward. I think there's increased political pressure on governments to do something about inequality. Some consumption, like consumption and retirement, is already largely funded by the government in many advanced countries. And there's this discussion of things like universal basic income. That is just a payment that every person gets simply for being a person from the government. A progressive wealth tax, that's Elizabeth Warren's policy. Wage subsidies, increased minimum wage, and so on. A whole set of government policies to reduce the level of inequality. I put this picture up just because I love this metaphor. So this is a quotation from Vasily Leontief, a Nobel Prize winner, who sort of talks about inequality. He starts by talking about horses and mules. He says, well, here's a case of technological progress that changed the value marginal product of different inputs, right? Horses and mules used to be valuable, and then tractors came along. The value marginal product of horses and mules went down. What happened? Well, horses and mules don't earn wages, but farmers own them and they feed them so that they can do their work. And when their value marginal product went down, farmers just basically stopped having horses and mules. Okay, so this is the number of horses and mules in the United States. Of course, the country's grown a lot, but there used to be 25 million of them, and now there's like 3 or 4 million, and they're mostly not working on farms anyway. Okay. what's the difference between low-skilled workers and horses and mules? Well, the difference is that low-skilled workers are our peers. They're members of our solidaristic economy. And so we're not going to kind of get rid of them. That would be a horrible thing to think about. And of course, they vote. So they have an actual say in what's going to happen going forward in a way that the horses and the mules didn't. OK. And here's, I won't read you this quotation either, but I think these slides will be available. Here's a quotation from Andrew Yang, one of our many, many presidential candidates in the United States. And he has a policy that he calls the freedom dividend. That's a universal basic income policy. So he says, you know, technology is taking jobs away from everyone. That's bad for the people who are losing their jobs. Plus, that's bad for the macroeconomy. So as he says in all the debates, you know, what would you do with an extra $1,000 a month? And people like me watch that and say, like, I think I would probably pay taxes because someone has to fund the extra $1,000 a month for everyone else. And I think I would probably be on the paying end rather than the receiving end. OK. So let me sort of talk about some of the issues that are raised by this rising role of government. Well, I said it here, but if you don't recognize it, this is the front piece from Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. And so that's a meditation on the role of the state. And this is the sovereign. I don't know if you can see, but his body is made up of people. So it's a kind of scary image. And of course, Hobbes was not talking about a welfare state or anything like that. In Hobbes's idea, you give up your liberty to the government because the government is protecting you from other people boinking you on the head and taking your stuff. So it's not that you're giving up your liberty so that you can get universal basic income or something like that. It's a much more primitive notion of what government does, but it's nonetheless a cool picture. OK, so I'm going to sort of think about a bigger role for government and how it affects some particular issues, the allocation of workers to tasks. It's very technical sounding, but I hope I can make sense of that. The amount of leisure, this idea of dignity of work, which is something that gets talked about a lot and I've been wrestling with only partially successfully over the last few years, and then the role of government and the future of democracy. Okay. So what does economics say about how some people end up in some jobs and some people work sometimes and not others? Well, so kind of conventional economics view is that people work for money, that they use to buy goods and services. If we weaken that link, if we weaken the link between how much stuff you can have and how much you work, that's going to reduce people's labor supply, right? So again, think about sort of introducing this freedom dividend. They're going to have to raise taxes on high-income people. That's going to sort of reduce their labor supply. And they're going to give money to poor people. That may reduce their labor supply as well. And sort of the classic name for this is the equity-efficiency trade-off. And that puts a practical constraint on the degree of redistribution. I think most economists would agree with that. The big question is sort of how tight is that constraint? So how much can I tax and transfer before I start disincentivizing people both at the top and the bottom of the income distribution to work? My personal view is that you can raise taxes quite a lot without disincentivizing people. And it's sort of worth pointing out that these are not the only ways of getting people to work. There are other approaches to the allocation of labor. You can command people to work, as with conscription. And in lots of other cases, people work without pay, either because it's sort of inherently pleasant to them. So I know plenty of economists who have stopped getting paid. They've retired as professors, but they continue to do research because they like it. Or because you value what you're doing. So you could volunteer in your community, you take care of your children, things like that. These are all work that you don't get paid for. OK. So the standard view in economics is that people sort of work, but if what they really want is leisure. And so there's this trade-off between this consumption I can get from working more and the extra leisure that I could afford if I didn't work more. And actually, I'm going to skip some of this. I'm going to skip a lot of this and just sort of say, in this setting, the wage is the opportunity cost of leisure. It's what I give up the leisure, it's the price I pay. Sorry, it is, when I have a unit of leisure, the amount that I have to pay for that is the wage that I give up. Finally got it, okay? If you give people non-wage income, if they inherit a bunch of money, if they get a government grant and so on, and wages don't rise, then people's labor input should fall, and potentially to zero. And we've now sort of had discussions in the United States and other countries, how big a problem is that? Okay, so could we see a society in which a fair number of people get money and do consumption but don't actually work? Is that sort of is that a utopia or a dystopia? And here's just sort of a list of some of the things that jobs provide beyond money, right? A structured framework, social setting, a sense of purpose, a feeling of being valued, which is clearly very important. And as I say here, dignity is somewhere in the above. I'm going to skip that data. Here's my kind of counter argument to that. So, you know, the dignity of work. So if you don't recognize them, these are the people from Downton Abbey. So they earn land rents. They own a big estate. They don't go work, and they seem to have pretty good lives. They kind of, you know, I wouldn't spend my time hunting, but whatever. And these are retirees in the United States. They also don't work. They get money from Social Security, and they also seem relatively happy. So we don't think, you know, when we think about retirees, we don't say that.
The upper percent of retirement.
These guys, these are not 1% people, I don't think. And we can discuss it after, but they don't have the trademarks of 1% people. Okay, so we don't think that not working is bad for retirees. Thanks. We know a lot of people dislike their jobs, and so maybe being a non-worker in a society of workers, that's actually what this data was. I guess I will mention. This is from Larry Summers and Ed Glazer and their co-author about sort of the happiness, people reporting low satisfaction in life as a function of how much they earn or whether they're not working. And what you see here is that, not unexpectedly, people who earn less are less satisfied than people who earn more. But the big jump comes not from sort of having lower earnings. The big jump comes from not working at all. So this is sort of their big brief against things like universal basic income. It says that, in fact, if you give people money but they don't work, that's not going to make them happy. Okay, as I said, these people seem pretty happy. I'm going to skip that slide. So sort of this thing of dignity, as I mentioned, I've been wrestling with this. I tried to define myself what dignity in a job is. And the answer seemed to be kind of good pay, honorable purpose, and pleasant working conditions. That's dignified. It seems, though, there are a lot of jobs that are relatively dignified that are lacking one or another of these things. School teachers don't get paid that much. Coal miners have bad working conditions, and lobbyists have nice conditions and high pay. I'm sorry. Before I met Susan. But they also seem relatively happy. So I think dignity is important, but dignity is also a kind of very malleable concept. I think that's something that we have to wrestle with. All right, the last thing, which I'm just going to cruise through super briefly, is what happens when you have this kind of redistribution being done in a democratic context. Did I already see the 3 minutes, or is that coming up? It's coming up. It's coming up. Okay. All right, good. Okay, so, you know, does that somehow open up the danger of oppression? Is it consistent with democracy? And so on. Here's a quote from Aristotle that I won't go into. Aristotle was not a big fan of democracy. Aristotle said, you know, if you sort of give power to the multitude, they're going to just redistribute and destroy the state. This is sort of the data that Aristotle was thinking of. He wasn't much of a quantitative social scientist. Here's the distribution of income in US households. It's this classic skewed distribution. And notice here that I've left out 3.8% of the households because I don't know which way we're facing, but I think, like, you know, this curve would go out to the Dead Sea or something if we included those guys. But the big point here is that in the United States and every other country that we've observed data on, mean income is higher than median income. If you think of the median income as sort of as political scientists talk about it, as the income of the median voter, that determines how much they want to redistribute. The gap between the mean and the median says that the person in the middle will always benefit from more redistribution. That's what Aristotle said. Okay. And indeed, if you look sort of at social spending, it's you know, if you're a small market kind of libertarian person, this is a super depressing picture because it shows that in all the developed countries, social spending as a share of GDP seems to rise almost inexorably over the course of the 20th century. This is, you know, and this social spending is largely redistributive. Here's some more recent data from a bunch of countries. Interestingly, Israel is kind of an exception to the rule. So Israel's social spending as a percentage of GDP hasn't risen since 1995. In all the other countries that I had data for, from the OECD at least, it was. Okay. And so what happens as inequality rises? Well, there's this possibility that sort of democracy can be undermined by this, right? We had a stable equilibrium of, you know, some inequality, some redistribution, and democracy. But now that inequality is rising, that's going to potentially undermine this. Okay, and here's sort of the broader conclusions. I guess depressingly, from our current economic, from a long-run perspective, this equilibrium that we've been in is neither inevitable nor permanent. Moderate inequality in value marginal products of labor seems consistent with democracy and the redistribution as we've seen it so far. It's not clear whether that holds together going forward. Economists need to think about this. I knew I was going to run out of time, so I knew I wouldn't get to these slides. Come talk to me or email me if you want. I've taken to reading books to understand the world better. And I think, you know, this is appropriate for Israel. Sometimes books and literature are very influential about how social policy gets set. I sort of have my little reading list that you should all read of books about redistribution, including Brave New World and Atlas Shrugged. And here's my happy ending thought, since those books are all very depressing. One way out of this box is that maybe technology can change the price of education. So one of sort of the driving forces here is it's very hard to raise education because education is very expensive. Technology has made a lot of things cheaper, like international phone calls and stuff like that. Technology in principle could make education a lot cheaper, and maybe that's the solution to the golden gaps problem. All right, I'm out of time, so thank you very much.